for joining for our final class about gardening here in the Bow Valley. And another thanks to the town of Canmore for sponsoring this series of videos. So we're continuing with the second part of the most practical side of the conversation about gardening. So let's jump into it. And so last week we were talking about the transplanted crop reference sheet from the Canadian Organic Growers Crop Planning Guide. And this one I didn't get to last week, but this is the direct seeded one. So it is very, very similar. We have the family that they belong to. We have the days to maturity, which in this case is how many days it takes, generally speaking, and it'll depend on varieties. Some varieties of these crops will be early varieties, so they would be ready earlier, and some take a little bit longer. You would look up, this is general days to maturity, but if you buy seeds from one of these seed websites, then they will have the specific days to maturity for that specific variety. So just a heads up there. This is just kind of like a general outline for what to expect, and then our planting frequencies and our seed rates. Yeah, pretty much all of this is similar to the transplanted crop reference sheet. So we shared this with the resources earlier today, so you should have this for reference. And I also wanted to touch upon, I did a slide last class about how to prepare a bed for direct seeded crops, and you can follow the same instructions if you like, or the same general pattern if you like for transplanting, but you don't have to be as full on as it is for the direct seeded crops, because and I kind of changed the way that I prep a bed for transplanting depending on the conditions of the soil. The first couple years at the school garden program, I would have to like jump on my broad fork with like all of my weight in order to get that compaction relieved and to get some aeration down in the soil. But as years have gone by, I haven't had to do that as much, or in some cases not at all. That structure, that porosity that's created through good soil food web activity has really, really improved the soil. So there are some occasions where I could just drop the bud fork into the soil, just let, and if it far enough, then I know there's enough structure there that I don't even have to disturb the soil, and I can add the soil amendments on top and rake it a little bit, and then put the mulch layer back over, and I'll just plant right into the bed like that without doing the broad forking or the preparing the seed bed the same way I do for direct seeded. So you just kind of play it by ear for that, and the more you do it, the more you'll see that disturbing the soil every time becomes superfluous if you have the right kind of activity, the right kind of biological activity in the soil, and the right kind of structure. So yeah, for a transplanted crop that's planted further away, then I have that mulch layer. Usually I'll try to put like a high nitrogen organic matter on the surface, and then put like a straw over top of that, so that the higher nitrogen, carbon to nitrogen ratio that's underneath that mulch layer, that will feed the soil food web, and it'll decompose biologically, rather than if something that's fresh and green is on top and not protected by a little bit of straw, then it'll just dry out and you tend to lose the nitrogen that you really want from that, through oxidation rather than the biological decomposition and returning those nutrients back in the soil. So, and then when I just go to plant, I'll plant right through that mulch layer. I'll just kind of make like a little hole with my finger and pull it back, and get the plug, the soil plug right in, and then press down, like I said before, with the potting up, and then yeah, it's a lot less disturbance, and a lot better for the soil in the long term if you can do that. So this. And now we're going to talk about some weeding. We've talked quite a bit about weeding throughout the class, so I won't spend too much time on this, but this is where that minimizing that soil disturbance can pay off as well. Not only are you creating that really good structure down below in the lower horizons, but the old way of double digging or of using a deeper penetrating rototiller that brings the deeper layers of soil up to the surface. You have to think about those deeper layers of soil. They have all sorts of opportunist weed seeds that have been buried below in those deeper horizons, and these weed seeds are very, very good at staying viable for decades and centuries. So every time we disturb deeper down in the soil and we bring those to the surface, then we're creating more work for us. And so that's another reason, along with all the other amazing reasons, why the broad fork and the tilde are such really good tools for using in the garden. So yeah, the less we can disturb those deeper horizons, the less work we're going to make for ourselves. And then another really effective way of weeding, it's like a passive way, is to add that mulch layer on top, and that creates those darker soil conditions right on the surface, and so that will trigger less of those weed seeds from germinating. And even if they do germinate, then they have to push through a couple inches of straw, or an inch or two of straw, and by the time they get through there, they will be in a weaker state. They'll be leggy because they didn't get as much light, and so they'll be even easier for us to pull them. And that's what we want to do. We want to be pulling them when they're as small as possible, so getting them early and often, and not spending any more than like 10 minutes at a time being bent over pulling them out. But lots of small short weeding periods are beneficial for our backs, and it just makes everything easier. And then we already talked about how if there are established weeds, we can out stubborn them by depriving them from establishing a source. The leaves are the source of energy production, and if we keep on pulling them, then it turns the root system as the source for new leaves, and we can weaken them and they'll give up. And then I promised, this is a picture that I took from my book called Edible Forest Gardens. And this is an example of a rhizome barrier that you could build if you have a lot of of these rhizomatic, probably like quackgrass or something like that, growing in your yard, and you want to establish a quackgrass-free garden bed, then this is a cool do-it-yourself at-home design using like chicken wire and some concrete, and you can build your own rhizome blocker so that they can't get through. You can also buy these cheap plastic rhizome barriers from garden centers, but I find that they are really expensive for not a lot of linear feet of them. So this is an alternative option that you might be interested in. And then we understand that a lot of these plants that we call weeds are ecologically, we could call them dispersive opportunists, because they put a lot of their energy, pretty much all their energy, on getting to that flowering, mature, and seed producing stage as fast as possible. And so if we deny their ability to get to this stage where they produce so many seeds and disperse them as much as possible, then we are saving ourselves a lot of work in the future. If they do make it to that flowering, mature stage, then when we do pull them out, it's important to separate those flower and seed heads, put them in a bucket, and either burn them or throw them directly in the garbage. Don't put any dispersive opportunist plant, any weed that's got to the flowering stage, into the compost, because they have the ability to, even if they're just in the flowering stage, they have enough energy left over in their stems and possibly their leaves or their root system, if you left that all intact, that they can actually get to that seed maturity stage by doing that. And then there's all sorts of really handy tools out there. We talked about the occultation tarps that we can stifle their ability to photosynthesize. And then we have these really nice tools. This one is called a collinear hoe. And we have a picture here in the top right of Elliot Coleman working with one. And you can see how just a little bit of practice, you're just shuffling it right along the surface of the soil. Maybe this blade, which should be nice and sharp, it's good to keep these blades sharp. You can stand up and do the weeding in a very ergonomic way for your back, and you're just shuffling it just below the soil surface, and you're just picking off right that interface where the root turns into the stem. And so that's how you get them when they're small. And you stifle their ability to get established. So this is a really great tool that I recommend. And then this is another one of my favorite tools for this. It's called a stirrup hoe, because it kind of looks like a stirrup. And same idea, you just kind of in the soil, maybe 1 to 2 centimeters deep in that soil, and you can pick off those opportunists when they're really small and you're not putting your back into an awkward position. And then I wanted to take some slides to talk about pest management, not just opportunists, but like more of your insect pests. And we've already talked several times about this. We talked about how important maintaining those healthy soil conditions are, and how all the ecosystem services that we enjoy from the soil food web, when it's in good shape, it does the work for us. So building healthy soils is really important. We've talked about planting woody, aromatic herbs around the brassicas, and how effective that is for confusing the insects that can smell or would be able to smell the brassicas if it wasn't for the aromatic pest confusers. So that's a very, very nice pattern in the garden to be able to grow some of those aromatic herbs and have the secondary benefit of them confusing the pests that want to put holes in the brassicas. So, and then over fertilizing is something we want to avoid. So watch out for that. Any questions, Elu?
Yeah, actually, we had one for the last slide, but I couldn't unmute quick enough.
Okay.
Katerina's wondering, the reason you put nitrogen under the mulch is because mulch consumes nitrogen to break down. Is that right?
It's because, so like what I mean by that is you can use different materials as a mulch. You don't just have to use straw. You can use grass clippings or coffee grounds. And the grass clippings and coffee grounds are higher nitrogen. And if you remember our discussion about nitrogen, it's very happy in the atmospheric form N2, and it's kind of volatile in any other form. So if we were to just mulch the surface of the garden bed with like coffee grounds or grass clippings, they would dry out, and therefore they would oxidize. And in that drying out and oxidizing process, the nitrogen that we want to cycle back into the soil and make available for our plants through the action of that soil food web, it would be volatilized into the atmosphere and lost from the system. So what I've found is that in order to cycle that nitrogen, you put it right next to the soil surface on top, and then cover it up with a high carbon, like a straw or something like that. And that way it doesn't dry out. It'll get the decomposers on it, like the bacteria and fungi, and then the worms will increase, or they'll make that process go faster. So that's what I've found. I've also found, like, one time I tried to just mulch with coffee grounds right on the surface without anything, and it actually developed a crust. And I noticed that when I watered it, it was like hydrophobic, and like there was no water actually penetrating down in the soil. It wicked it away. So you can have something like that, which you don't want. I hope that's helpful. And these two quotes are from a really good book called Shattering that I read. I've already packed that book away, but the common response to an insect pest or a disease-causing pest in the past, or at least the past 70 years, has been to reach for the pesticide right away. And what we see in reality is that the pesticides, these synthetic neurotoxic pesticides, are not actually working at all. You can see here that in the last 40 years, the percentage of annual crop lost to insect has actually doubled. I know this is a US stat, but it's actually doubled rather than decreased. And so in the first presentation where I was talking about how one of the things that seeds do, one of their functions in that sexual reproduction process, is this chance for a fluke mutation in that DNA copying process. And I've also talked about dispersive plants, how their ecological niche is to produce a lot of seeds really, really quickly. Well, you could think about these insect pest populations as being like the dispersives of the insect world, because they have really, really quick reproduction cycles, and their offspring is prolific. And so same with the problem with herbicides and weeds is the same things happening with pests. Because they have so many offspring so quickly and we're exposing them to more and more pesticides, the chances of some random genetic mutation or some change in the genetic expression of one of those individuals within that population is so much higher. And so they're evolving resistance to these neurotoxin pesticides really, really quickly. And because of that, because of this evolution, you can see here, 1945 is considered the start of the Green Revolution, where we started to grow food with a lot more synthetic chemical, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and these F1 hybrids that I'm going to talk about later. And so you can see how originally at the start of that, we, at least in the States, again, I know this is a United States stat, but what we're doing here in Canada in our food systems isn't that different. You can see that less than 200 million pounds of pesticides were used in the States at the start of the Green Revolution. And 30 years later, that the amount of pesticides that they needed to use in order to try to control these pests was so much higher because of this evolution that's going on. So that's happening with pesticides and insects. It's happening with herbicides and weeds. The more herbicides we've been spraying on fields, the more these dispersive weeds are evolving resistance to it. And it's also happening, there's this superbug problem in hospitals where the more we've used antibiotics, the more those microbes have quickly evolved resistance to them. And so something to consider. One of my favorite ways of controlling pests is a crop rotation. And so this is one of the reasons why understanding crop families is so important. And this is an example from the high school garden. This is kind of like the layout of what I had it a couple years ago. And you can see down at the bottom the different plant families that are in each section. And so what happens is in that year, a couple years ago, I had the brassicas all in this far right section. But the next year, they move over to what I call Grotto Mountain section. And then the next year, they would be in the Lady Mac section. And then the next year, so every year, I'm moving the plant families around. And you can see I do have brassicas here and here. And that's not a really, that's only 2 years in between the brassica families. But it does work quite effectively. The way I like to explain it is with carrots. Carrots are susceptible to something called carrot rust fly. And so if I were to get a little bit of damage with carrot rust fly in this year, the carrots that I was growing there. And then the next spring, when that larvae wakes back up and I had carrots there again, then it would be a full-on buffet for that larvae. They would have a foothold, and then they would have exactly what they like to eat. Pests are very species or botanical family specific on what they find is palatable. So if they wake up the next spring and they want to eat more carrots, but the carrots are all the way over here this year, then that's a way of keeping that pest population off balanced and confused. And it's a good way of mitigating the pest damage that you have potential for. So little basic crop rotation explanation there for you. And then when it comes to controlling pests, one of the best strategies is to know their enemies and to know what their enemies like. So these are some of my best friends in the garden. We have spiders or daddy longlegs up here that are really broad spectrum predators. We have our trichogramma flies, which like to go after the flea beetles. Then we have our lacewings that their larvae, they actually lay their larvae into aphids, which we'll see can be very problematic, but their larvae parasitize the aphids, and they're called aphid lions. This is a hoverfly. It looks like a wasp, but it's actually a really great broad spectrum predator to have in the garden. And then we love our ladybugs. This one, does anybody know what that one is? No. So this is actually ladybug larva. This is like the baby form of ladybugs. So if you ever see one in the garden that looks like that, that's what will turn into one of our favorite broad spectrum predators. And then we have a red-breasted nuthatch and a mountain bluebird. Chickadees are also really, really great. All of these bird species are known as foliar feeders, so they eat a lot of bugs right off the leaves in the garden, the insects. So they're really great. And then I've had an ongoing problem with voles in the garden. We have American kestrels up here, and so it's all about trying to create favorable niches for our friends, so that they can make life for our those pests that much harder. And I would like to tell a quick little story about the Exshaw School greenhouse. A couple years ago, it was the first year we were growing in there, and about midway through the summer, I got an email from some volunteers, and they were really, really worried because there was all of a sudden this population boom of all these white flies and aphids, and they were really worried that they were going to destroy all the crops that we were growing in there, and we had to kill them as soon as possible and get them under control. And so I went out there and I looked at it, and we had sunflowers and calendula flowers growing on the outside of the beds. And that was with the idea of wanting to feed some of our beneficials. And so when I went in there and looked, I definitely saw a lot of damage from these white flies and aphids, but it was only occurring to the sunflowers and the calendula. And they hadn't got to any of the tomatoes yet. They weren't on the cucumbers. They weren't on any of the food crops. And so, yeah, it was kind of worrisome to see all those white flies and aphids. But the closer I looked, not only were they not causing damage to the food crops that we cared about, but the more I looked, I saw a population of hoverflies, and I saw lacewings in there. And so I was pleading with the volunteers, like, I know it looks bad right now, but we have some beneficials in there. And once they start to get their population numbers up, then this population ecology is going to level itself out. And sure enough, luckily we didn't kill anything in there. We dealt with the damage that year. It was, I was just wanting them to understand that if we were to kill all the insects in there, then we would be forced to go into these boom and bust cycles of population ecology. Whereas if we just let the ecology stabilize in that first year, then it should be manageable in future years. And lo and behold, like the next year, there was still like a little bit of whitefly and aphid problem, but it had kind of controlled itself. And so sometimes when we see the pests, like we want to get in control and we want to manage it, but sometimes we should just trust nature and let it sort of sort itself out. If we had killed all the bad insects at that point, then all the good insects that were starting to get established in there, they would have starved, and so we would have kept on fighting this. Whereas we luckily were able to let nature kind of balance itself out. So that's a little introduction. It's called integrated pest management. This idea of creating favorable habitat for the beneficials and letting them do the work for us. So then this is like a crop family sort of a breakdown based on each crop family that you might have in the garden. And so this is a list of the common brassicas that you might plant.
Is doing well. And to be honest, it was
okay. Alyssum you might not be familiar with, but it's in the brassica family. It's actually this very small flowered flowering. We don't eat it, but it feeds those trichogramma and the hoverflies, and so it provides the nectar and the pollen as a supplemental food source, so that once these flea beetles come on, then they'll help us control it. So flea beetles can be a problem, but the way I have dealt with it is to plant a lot of flowers like alyssum and try to create that balanced ecology. And sometimes it's not perfect. This is what it looks like when we have problems with it, but it's the damage has decreased over the years. And then we also, in the turnips that I've been growing, this is what it looks like when you have cabbage root maggot. And it can be a problem, but the way I've dealt with cabbage root maggot for turnips is that I've noticed that you only really get damage from this insect when they're in the larval stage, which is from mid-June to mid-July. So I get an early crop of turnips out, planted early in the spring, and we're able to crop out by around the first week of June. And then I just won't have any in the ground for that time period. And then once we get to mid-July, then we can plant another crop, and we just kind of avoid that insect problem by just not having them in the ground when those larvae would be present. And then the other thing that can cause problems, that I've seen cause problems with brassicas here, is sometimes we get slugs. I'll talk about slugs in this next slide about lettuce. So this is the Asteraceae family, and some people call it the daisy family because they produce flowers that look like daisies. And so then these are some of the main crops or some of the main plants that you might associate in this family. And lettuce is really the only one that I've seen get any kind of problems. The sunflowers were getting really eaten up by the aphids and the whiteflies in that greenhouse. And from my perspective, I had never seen them get attacked by aphids or whiteflies before. And I feel like that was good feedback because we put like a cool, loving crop into a hothouse. And the fact that they were getting chewed up by these whiteflies and aphids was kind of feedback showing that they just weren't comfortable and they were stressing in these hot conditions that they're not adapted to. So that was like the other little learning opportunity that I took away from that greenhouse story. But you can have some problems with aphids in your lettuce, and so I've had that just very rarely, but yeah, again, I like to have lots of hoverflies and lacewings looking after. This is what an aphid looks like. And then the leaves will kind of start to curl up when you have a lot of aphid damage. But slugs have been one of the bigger problems that I've run into in the gardens over the years. And honestly, the best way of dealing with slugs, in my experience, is when the Alpenglow class, they had chickens. And so we built like a little chicken tractor, like a bottomless, basically coop. There was no bottom to it, but it was 2x4 framed, and then there was chicken wire all around it. And so at the high school one year, I could barely get a bed of baby lettuce started because the slugs were so bad. And then we started putting the chickens out there, and they would scratch through the soil, and they would eat everything, all the slugs, all the slug eggs. They would help eat the stubble from the last crop, and a little bit of manure as a fertilizer. And that's the best way, in my opinion, of controlling slugs. I know that's a little bit problematic because chickens might be considered a potential life attractant. But they solve the problem so good. And I would recommend it if we can find a way to have sort of like chickens for rent here in Canmore and have it done responsibly. I think that would be the best pattern to solve it. The other ways of getting rid of slugs is they don't like copper. So if you have a bed built, you can line it with copper around the edge, and that'll keep them out. Also, beer traps can work because it expands, and cornmeal traps. They're attracted to cornmeal. If you let it, make it available in like a jar, they'll go in there and they'll eat it, and then as it goes from being dehydrated to moistening, then it expands and it kind of blows them up, or it kills them because it expands in their stomach. So those are the other ways that I've tried to deal with them. But honestly, the chickens were the best, and chickens are just fun to have around, and they'll lay you eggs on top of that. And then bacterial wilt can be a problem with lettuce as well. This is from conditions where you don't have enough air movement around the base between the soil level and those base leaves. Making sure that that there's air movement around there. That's where mulch can be some sort of a little bit of a love-hate relationship. If the mulch comes too close around the lettuce, then it can stifle that air movement and create a little bit of bacterial wilt. So you have to kind of pull back that mulch enough so we can get some air movement through there. And the next one is the Chenopodiaceae family. And the main pest to be worried about and to look out for is this larval bug called a leaf miner. And this is a picture of what leaf miner damage looks like. The only solution, at least the only non-poisoning solution, is as soon as you see this in the garden, I mean, it's good to have a good crop rotation and to have it in different bits of soil every year, so that these populations don't build up. But I've found even with a crop rotation, I do run into this damage. And so what you got to do for this is you just have to take, as soon as you see some of this damage, you'll take those leaves and you won't compost them. You got to throw them right into the garbage. I mean, you don't have to throw the whole thing. You can cut off just the damaged part and you can cook with the rest. But if you were to put it into the compost, then you're just continuing the problem. The next time you use that compost in the garden, you're just reintroducing those insects back to that soil. So, and again, you'll only really see this damage from maybe, depends on the weather, but it could be anywhere between mid-May to the end of June, and then you won't see that pattern anymore. So just be looking out for that, and move them into different soil and try to get rid of that larvae and eliminate it as best as possible. That's the solution there. I've visited friends' gardens and just seen like entire rows of beets or entire rows of spinach that's just has this leaf miner all through it, and they just weren't able to identify the insect and understand how to deal with it. They were planting the same thing in the same soil every year and couldn't figure it out. So that's an important thing to look out for. And then I also tend to have problems with voles, especially for the beets. Voles really love to eat beets, so that's where trying to trap them and keep their population levels small, and trying to try to attract in. There's a really great site, Cornell Nest Watch. Cornell University has this website, and they have recommendations for making bird boxes and roosting boxes, and so that's a great way to introduce some wildlife into the area, and they help us control these little guys that are just prolific reproducers. And then we'll move on to the nightshade family, or Solanaceae family. And one of the main problems that we can run into with this family is this powdery mildew pattern. So it's like a fungal disease that can really affect a lot of these plants. But the best way to prevent this to begin with is to have really good air movement through it. Generally will grow not potatoes, but the rest of these, and not tobacco, I guess, but eggplant, peppers, and tomatoes, they're generally hothouse crops. So if you have a hothouse conditions, these are great to grow, but just make sure you have a lot of air movement, and the greenhouse isn't too humid, because that's when you're really going to run into this problem. If you do start to see, you got to be on the lookout. If you do see any of this whatsoever, you got to get those out of the greenhouse or out of the garden as soon as possible, before they're able to sporulate and infect other plants. So you would throw them right in the garbage, or you burn them. Another problem that you might run into is spider mites. So this is a picture of little spider mites up here, and this is the damage that they could do to the leaves of this family. And again, you could use a pesticide on them, or you could use an insecticidal soap if you want. But I've found, like, if I notice them fast enough, if I see them, then I can just start taking off, just whack them off. And they have such a short life cycle that if you knock them off their food source, it takes so much energy to get back up there. So if you're able to catch them early enough and spray them off there, then they can be pretty easily managed just through spraying them off with water. But if not, and they have become a problem, then look at a more aggressive solution. The other problem you can have here with tomatoes specifically, could happen with others, but the only time I had blossom end rot was on tomatoes, And so when I looked it up, it said you either are lacking calcium in the soil, or you've been watering the soil regularly or like patchy. And so ever since I read that, I watered all around the tomato plants very consistently, and I haven't had that problem since. So it's blossom end rot, because this is what was the flower blossoms, and the fruit emerged from the swollen ovaries behind it. But yeah, so if you ever get this problem, then I would put my money on just patchy watering. It kind of stresses them out a little bit. There's also a problem called blight. I haven't had this very much at all, so I have to look up. It's kind of similar to the powdery mildew, in that it can be, the best way to prevent it is through really good air ventilation all through the leaves, and it stops that problem generally from starting in the first place. But if it does happen, then you want to get rid of that material that you've found it, and burn it or throw it in the garbage, stop it from spreading to the other plants. But yeah, we're kind of, the growing conditions in the Bow Valley are challenging temperature wise, but we are also kind of lucky because there isn't a lot of agriculture going around. So like a blight doesn't really reach us the same way it would in areas where more growers are. And then lastly, this is why I put tobacco in here, and tobacco mosaic virus. If anybody's a smoker out there, you could transfer this disease from the tobacco on your cigarettes to if you're growing any of these in a greenhouse or something, then if you don't wash your hands thoroughly with soap and hot water, then you're risking spreading this tobacco mosaic virus to any of the plants in this family. So watch out for that. And then we already talked, the only plant crop in this family that I've ever had a problem with is the carrots. And so this is an example of what carrot rust fly would look like. I've never had big problems because I'm always using that cropped rotation in order to be growing in fresh soil every year. I have met people who have told me that you can't grow carrots in Canmore because of carrot rust fly, but I suspect that they didn't have a good crop rotation, because I haven't run into any extensive damage. I've had a little bit spot here and there, but it hasn't been a big problem. And then voles really love carrots as well. So one of the ways I've gotten away from voles is to grow, if I have to grow carrots or beets, I try to grow them in raised containers where the voles can't get them. And then on to the mint family, Lamiaceae family. And there aren't very many problems with this family. I have noticed a couple times, this is a little bug called the spittle bug, because it covers itself in like this, I don't know, what do you call it? It's like, yeah, it looks kind of like saliva, like bubbled up saliva. That's like its protective mechanism from predators. But I've found them a couple times on my rosemary plants, and I just pick them off and chuck them away. But something to look for. I don't know how much damage they actually do, but and actually I've read differing things. Some people say they're harmless, and some people say that they are conduits for viruses and diseases. So just look out for that. And then I have had issues with spider mites on basil. Same thing as I said before. You can use pesticides if you want, or you can just try to blast them off with some water. And then it's not a disease thing, but we talked about how the woody herbs like thyme, sage, rosemary, and oregano, they're very sensitive to having moisture around their, like excessive amounts of moisture just sitting around the root system. So if you're growing any of these, I recommend like a very sandy, kind of gritty soil that'll allow free drainage to go through, and they'll be quite happy. And then the gourd family, the Cucurbitaceae family, they are quite susceptible to this powdery mildew. So again, same way of dealing with that is just to make sure that they're not in humid, stale air conditions. Just good air movement around their leaves will prevent them. I guess I should also mention this family and the nightshade family that tomatoes are in. You want to be careful when you water them. You really don't want to get their leaves wet at all. So always kind of watering down at the soil level, especially for those two families. If they have standing water on their leaves, then the powdery mildew will become an issue pretty quickly. And they're frost sensitive, so don't put them outside until you know we're past our frost-free window, which is around the 3rd week of May. The next family is the allium family, and I cannot for the life of me think of any pest or disease problems that I've run into them. If anybody has had any issues, let me know. But yeah, they're pretty pest free. And the same with the legume family, the Fabaceae family. I have yet to encounter any problems with pests with them. So. And so if you want to be more proactive, I know I'm a little bit, maybe I'm a little too laissez-faire with this whole idea of letting the ecologies balance them out. But if you want to be more proactive, then I would suggest looking into horticultural oils, or diatomaceous earth can be a very good solution, a more organic, natural solution to any potential pest problems. And then I'm not necessarily against pesticides altogether. Like if you need to use a synthetic pesticide because the problem has become so overwhelming, then by all means do so. It is just a tool at the end of the day. But please try to consider it as like your last resort rather than like the de facto first thing that people think of if they have a pest problem, you know? Yeah, I don't mean to demonize pesticides. You know, we could use them. It's just when we abuse them and just think that they're the only solution is where we run into problems. And I've also found when I have had pest problems, like when I have had flea beetle infestations in the brassicas, it's a nice little reminder. I mean, food doesn't have to be flawless all the time, and we're not the only organisms in this biosphere that have to eat. I've been able to sell that or use the arugula that has those holes in. The flatbread company was always willing. I would give them a discount and they just turn it into a pesto or something like that, you know. Because the food that we grow in our garden isn't flawless like we see in the supermarket doesn't mean it's not edible. And yeah, just a reminder that there are these articles out there. We tend not to see them because a lot of people are tuned out of the news because there's this constant clown show and politics going on. But there are these really important headlines that a lot of people are missing when they tune out. We're living in an extinction level event right now. the biodiversity among insects and birds is just drastically collapsing right now. So that would be my my plea to those people out there who just want to use pesticides as that first tool for managing them. Yeah, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And so I want to move on to that crop steering portion of the class. Does anybody have questions about pest management before I move on?
I don't see any questions here, but I'm really happy now I know what happened to my spinach and beets last year.
Yeah.
Leaf
yeah.
miners.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, the leaf miners.
A question just popped up. Brooke's wondering, do you buy pests?
Sorry?
Do you buy pests?
Do I buy beneficials?
Yeah, predators with a asterisk.
Yeah. I haven't. I haven't. I know you can. Yeah, you can buy ladybugs, and you can buy. Yeah, you can buy predators. But I've always tried to take the point of view of just trying to create an attractive environment for them to come and make a home. If I didn't do that, if all I did was buy the predators like the ladybugs, then but I didn't have like a bloom calendar. So one thing, kind of a cool design idea, is to create a bloom calendar so that you'll have your early flowering plants, and then your mid-flowering plants, and your late flowering plants, and just trying to make sure that there's always this supplemental food source for those beneficials, and just trying to make it as a friendly place as possible for them once they find it, and they'll just set up shop and they'll do that work for us. So I've never bought any. I think it makes more sense in like a protected culture in a closed greenhouse where they can't get out, but I'm pretty much outdoors, and I could spend $30 on them and then they could just fly away for all I know. So
yeah,
but yeah, that's a good question.
A couple more questions have come in. Allie's wondering, what is a diatomaceous earth? And then the question she had was examples of horticultural oils.
I've never used horticultural oils. I just, there was a greenhouse designer that I was helping with the Sutina with their greenhouse, and we got this kit from this guy in Nebraska, and he says he's never used any synthetic pesticides, but he really recommends horticultural oils. So I haven't used them yet, but this guy's an experienced grower, and so I just want to add that in. I guess I'll look it up and add it to the but diatomaceous earth is there are protozoa called diatoms, and they are basically, their outer structure is basically like glass. It's like silica, and so diatomaceous earth is like, once those diatoms died and floated, or they sunk to the bottom of the water that they were living in, then it creates like this really jagged, like at a microscopic level, it's very, very jagged. And so if you can buy diatomaceous earth and mix it up in water, and then you spray it on the plants that are getting affected. If it's an insect that's feeding on those leaves, then they go and eat it, and it basically just tears up their digestive system. But it's biological, so it's considered like a natural pesticide, rather than a pesticide that's basically been it comes from war technology for neurotoxins.
Yeah, sounds a little more friendly. And then Carla has a question. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with ground squirrels?
Oh, ground squirrels. I've just never had to deal with ground squirrels yet. I'd say that, I mean, yeah, you kind of stumped me on that one. I would just say, again, think about what their natural predators would be. So like owls, creating nice conditions for owls, and so forth. And there's also another suggestion that I can put out there. I mean, I think a squirrel would be afraid, there would be naturally afraid of like snakes and cats and things like that. And so some people, and there's actually like synthetic urine that you can buy. Like, so you can buy like bobcat urine, you can buy like wolf urine. And so the idea of these, I know that sounds ridiculous, but if like a ground squirrel or a vole was in your garden and they smelt the urine of one of their natural enemies, then they probably wouldn't be hanging out there so much. So
Carla said she's tried the urine and it didn't work.
Yeah. I've heard mixed reviews about that.
Yeah, my sister in Calgary has a lot of trouble with squirrels, and the only thing that's worked for her is like putting like wire cage around her garden. Yeah. Another question, from Bridget, do your school gardens have any trouble from Canmore's feral bunnies?
No, we haven't had any problems with bunnies over the years. What we did was we took chicken wire and we extended it along the fence line 2 feet up, and then we buried it a foot down and then skirted it a foot out. And so they're never. Also, the middle school garden is there's a big field around it, and so it's very exposed. I don't think they like being exposed that far away from their homes, and so I think that helped as well. I did have a marmot this past summer. I trapped a marmot and drove it out to Gap Lake and found the garden somehow. That was an adventure.
That's cool. Yeah, never heard of it.
I was.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh.
No.
Weird internet things happening here. Eileen's wondering, do you recommend using potassium soap?
Potassium soap? I have never heard of it, or I'm not familiar with it, so no. But if she wants to tell us what it's for.
Eileen, do you want to unmute yourself and talk a little bit about potassium soap? No pressure if you don't, that's okay.
Yeah, well, we can all look it up afterwards.
Yeah. That's all the questions we've.
Potassium soap. Okay, sweet. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I want to get to crop steering, but I'm going to use tomatoes as the example of crop steering. So let's talk a little bit about tomatoes first and put it into context. There is a difference between, there's two main varieties of tomatoes. There are determinate bush varieties, which don't require any pruning whatsoever, and they will produce all at once. They'll just go into this fruiting stage and produce all their fruit at once. And the way that you keep them upright with all that weight is you just use some of these tomato cages. in order to help sturdy them. I haven't used these too much. I haven't grown bush varieties. I prefer to grow indeterminate vining varieties. And so they produce over a long period of time. So rather than just like getting all your tomatoes in the space of like 1 or 2 weeks, these will produce for a couple months once they start producing. And so these do require pruning, especially you can see this is our main stem coming up here. These are our axillary branches, which is our main energy production. And then at the little axils between the main stem and these secondary axillaries are what we call the sucker branches on the tomatoes. And if you let these sucker branches just grow, then it's going to turn into just an absolute jungle of a plant. Because these sucker branches can grow, and then they can grow sucker branches off of them, which grow sucker branches off them. And it gets so hard to even penetrate the plant. There's so much vegetative growth. It's a really good idea. If you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, then once you see these little guys trying to grow right there, either pinch them off when they're really small, or if they've managed to get a little bit bigger, you want to take pruning shears and make sure to cut those back before they take too much of the plant's energy. The first year I was afraid of pruning those, but the second year I started doing it and got way more tomatoes off of them. And then at the end of the year, it was way easier to clean up the greenhouse. It makes airflow around the tomatoes that much better because, like I said, having airflow around tomatoes is really, really important. So pruning sucker branches is pretty much, that's essential pruning work that you have to do for indeterminate tomatoes. And then another way of pruning tomatoes is once they get to a certain size, you can start pruning. It's called hard pruning. You start to prune off the lower leaves. Those lower leaves, as the tomato plant gets bigger, they get less and less light anyways. So as the tomato plant keeps growing, to prune those and that again encourages airflow below. And as you'll see when I talk about crop steering, it's also beneficial for producing more tomatoes. So those are really important things to understand there. And then when you prune tomatoes, especially in a greenhouse, you want to remove those prunings out of that greenhouse and away from those plants, because if you were to mulch the soil with those prunings, then they are very, very susceptible to that powdery mildew disease. And once they start to sporulate, then they can infect the living plants. So whenever you're pruning tomato plants, just get those prunings out and away from all the other nightshade families in order to avoid the disease problems. And then if there are any tomatoes that are showing signs of disease, then you would want to either prune them last, or you'd want to sterilize your pruner between tomato plants so that you're not transferring disease from one tomato to the next. And then the next, so because they're indeterminate vining varieties, the way that I trellis them is I would take a wooden dowel, like a stick, and I would basically run a nylon twine to an overhead structure above and have it nice and tight and right by the plant root system. And as the tomatoes grow, you're just, every couple days, you just twist that apical tip, this growing leader tip, around, and that'll keep it upright and stable. So that's the way to trellis them. And then you can do some funky things with tomatoes too, because of these sucker branches. You can have like the one leading tip here going up, and then if you wanted to leave one or two of these sucker branches and turn them into like extra leaders, then you could create on one rootstock, you could create two different leaders of the plant and increase your production there. You would just do another trellis for them. So you have like the rootstock there, the main stem, and then the main leader, and then the first sucker branch you might actually let grow on, and then prune out all the rest of the sucker branches, and then you have two leaders and more flowers and more fruits. And then tomato plants are really easy to propagate via vegetative production, something called layering. We talked about how tomato plants have these, they have those trichomes that can turn into adventitious roots really easily. They have a lot of meristematic properties to them. And so it's really easy to take one of those sucker branches and basically let it grow on and like take it down to the soil and basically clamp it down to the soil with a little landscape staple. And those trichomes will turn into a root system. And once they do, you can cut it from the parent plant, dig up that root system, and now you have a second clone of that plant if you should so choose. So, and then another option is when you're pruning these sucker branches, again, with those trichomes that have that meristematic, that adventitious root sort of tendency, is you could actually plant. It's basically like the most easy cutting that you easily, and again, you have another plant if you should so choose. Okay, so now we get to talk about plant partitioning and crop steering. And so what we need to understand for this is that plants, they make decisions. They only have so much energy available to them at one time, and they divide that energy based on our vegetative growth or generative growth. And so sometimes they grow in a very balanced way, and sometimes they'll grow in a vegetative trend or a generative trend. So obviously here, vegetative is they'll be putting more of their energy. If they're in a vegetative growth pattern, then they'll put more of their energy to the root, stems, and leaves. And if they're in a generative trending, then they'll partition more of their energy towards the flower, fruits, and seeds. And so one really interesting example that we talked about in the first class is this masting behavior of like oak trees, and how they can go a number of years of not producing any nuts or acorns, and then all in one year that every individual plant in a whole bioregion will trend generative. And so that's a natural kind of example of how plants only have this so much energy available to them, and they kind of make decisions on whether they want to put it into their vegetative growth or whether they want to flip the switch and start to go into this reproductive cycle. And so what's interesting about tomatoes, and actually I should say this is from this book, The Greenhouse and Hoop Hoop House Grower's Handbook. This is where I got this chart and this information about crop steering. And so the tomatoes are the best thing to look for this. And we understand that tomatoes, the reason why we grow a tomato plant is for the fruit. We don't eat the leaves, right? And so we want to encourage the plant to grow more of this generative side of the growth. But if they put too much of their energy into the generative growth, then they'll start to peter out. They'll run out of energy because they're not putting as much energy into their leaves. And so for the most of the time, we want them to be nice and balanced so that we not only we get fruits today and this week, but a month or so from now, it'll still be producing. It won't run out of energy. And so maybe a helpful way of thinking about this is sources and sinks. The leaves are the source of the energy, and the fruits are the sinks for the energy. And yeah, so if they're sinking too much of their energy into making so much of the flowers and fruits, then the leaves will suffer, and then eventually the entire plant will suffer. And you can actually see, it's almost like once you start to look for these patterns in it, you'll actually start to see which direction they're trending in. And so a tomato plant that is in a vegetative trending stage will have really luxurious and thick, leathery and dark green leaves, whereas a plant that's putting more of its energy into the fruits and flowers will have like smaller, thinner, and light green leaves. And then the stem thickness will be different. The density of their heads up at this leading tip, as you can see, will be different. In the greenhouse kind of culture, these flower clusters are called trusses. So if a plant is too far in the generative stage, then they'll have, or sorry, in the vegetative stage, then they'll have like these misshaped kind of flower clusters. This is a really perfect looking flower cluster with good proportions there. But when they're too far in the vegetative stage, then they'll be sticking straight up, and they won't have a very consistent amount of flowers. Yeah, so all of these, if you start to look at a tomato plant as it grows, all of these you'll start to see as like basically like signposts for the plant, telling you what trend it is in, which way it's trending. And like I said, we want them to be balanced most of the time, but yeah, well, once you start to see these, and with this next chart, you can actually steer them in the right direction. So as an example, at the Exshaw School greenhouse this past summer, our tomato plants had that really luxuriant growth. The leaves were curling, the flower trusses were lower down on the stems. They had all these weird flower truss abnormalities. It was showing all of these signs over here. And so being able to see that, we were able to change the way we were managing them. And so I started hard pruning the leaves lower down a lot more aggressively, and that trended it towards the generative phase, and we got more fruits out of it. And we changed our watering system up a little bit, so it was getting a lot of water consistently. And so in order to push it from this vegetative trending stage into a more balanced growth, we watered it a little bit less. And so between the pruning and the amount of leaf pruning and a little bit of water stress, we were able to move it and balance them. And you can steer them too far in one direction and start to use these other techniques to kind of get them back into balance. So these are all things that you can do. Looking at tomatoes in a protected culture, of how to get them in the right state so that they produce at their highest capacity. And so it is recommended, like when you transplant your tomatoes into the greenhouse initially, a more vegetative trending growth pattern for those first couple weeks is recommended, because you want them to get as much energy and as much capability of producing more energy as possible. But after that couple weeks, you want to kind of steer them over to the more generative stage. And then right at the end of the season, when you know there's only a couple weeks of warmer temperatures left, and you know there's really no point of worrying about them being balanced, then you can really start to do some of these tactics in order to get the most fruit load out of them at the end of the season. You'll also see, we've talked about nitrogen, how nitrogen is better in the vegetative stage, and so you can see it's agreeing there. And then when they're in the generative stage, more of the phosphorus and potassium. And then there's a couple of these, like this is for professional growers, like a professional greenhouse can augment CO2 levels in order to produce the best conditions of what they need. Yeah, I think like this here, you can, when they're in this vegetative, when they're early in their life cycle and they're in that vegetative stage, to have a very flat temperature profile is really beneficial. Anybody have questions about that?
Yeah, this is blowing my mind. As a new gardener, I gotta admit, I didn't know what crop steering was before tonight. But yeah, this is explaining a lot of my tomato woes last summer. Brooke has a question. First of all, she never thought to use sucker branches as cuttings, so she's pumped on that. But her question is the crop steering chart only about tomatoes?
No, the next slide, I'll talk about how, I'm just talking about them in the context of tomatoes, but the next slide, I'll show a couple different examples of how you can transfer this into other crops.
Okay, awesome. And before you flip to that next slide, Eileen shared in the chat, she elaborated a little bit more on potassium soap. So it is an insecticide and acaricide, I don't know if I said that right, to prevent the most common pests of the garden in an ecological and natural way. So
okay,
yeah,
that's a great tip. I appreciate that.
Great. I think that's it for now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Eileen. I'm going to look into that. Okay. So yeah, that's a quick kind of version for tomatoes, but let's talk about how we can see this, how this can apply to other crops. So peppers, actually in this book, they have a chapter on peppers as well. And what they recommend is when a pepper grows, it has one main stem coming up. And as soon as it goes from its juvenile vegetative state and it moves into its mature flowering state, that first flower that it produces, it's called the king flower, apparently, for pepper producers. And it's recommended that you do not let that first flower actually form a fruit. So you should pick that flower off, because pepper plants at that stage are not, they don't have enough energy at that to partition their energy between the leaves that they still have to produce and to produce that first fruit. It would slow down production for the rest of their life. So that first flower that will appear is like, you pick that off, and then you have a choice to make with the peppers. After that king flower appears, it will branch off into 2 stems. So it'll Y off like that. And so you can allow 2 leaders to form on that. And you can trellis those leaders if you like, and grow the fruits that they produce. Or if you prune one of those leaders and keep it a single leader, then the fruits that they will produce will be bigger. If you keep it to a single leader, rather than letting them branch off, then you'll be growing bigger peppers. But if you like smaller peppers, then you can let it branch off once, and then keep going like that. But every time it produces, it's going to try and split into 2. And so you can prune it back to however many leaders, apical leaders that you want, in order to grow the size of peppers that you want. And again, this is just, their plant only has so much energy available to it at one time. So you're making decisions with it in order to devote how much energy it's going to put towards the vegetative, or how much it's going to put into each one of the fruits, if that makes sense. And it's still the similar thing with cucumbers. So cucumbers are like very, very similar to indeterminate vining tomatoes. Every time they grow up and they reach a node, then they will produce a main petiole, like 1 leaf that's for energy, 1 tendril for climbing, and then they'll produce a sucker branch, which I recommend most of the time you're going to want to prune that sucker branch and keep it going just like 1 main leader up the trellis. And then if it's a long English cucumber variety, then you would only want 1 fruit per node. If you let 2 flowers get pollinated on there, and for the large fruiting variety of cucumbers, if you let 2 fruits go off of there, then it'll be too much energy, and it'll stifle the rest of the production of the plant. So for long English big cucumbers, only 1 fruit should be allowed per node to get established. Whereas if you're growing pickling cucumbers, you can let 2 fruits per node go. And because they're smaller and require less energy, it's not going to cause problems with the plant partitioning and later production. But the way that I did cucumbers this year and had a lot of success was to be very aggressive of pinching off those sucker branches at each one of the nodes that tried to produce, and keeping the 1 leader, trellising up the 1 string. And then when it got to the very top, we had a cross trellis like that. And we actually let 1 sucker branch grow. And so it's called umbrella trellising. So you go up, and once you get to the top, you let the 1 leader go 1 way for a foot, and then it starts to go back down. And then you let that 1 sucker go off in the other direction, and it comes down, and it kind of looks like a nice umbrella. And if you're aggressive with that sucker branch pruning, and you're basically steering the crop so that they don't put their energy in that sucker branch being vegetative growth, you're helping them concentrate that energy on the fruit production. It's afraid to prune your tomatoes and cucumbers so aggressively, but I've seen, like, they really, really respond very favorably to it. So don't be afraid. And then if we think about it in the context of rhubarb and sorrel, these are both perennial herbaceous plants, and we grow them not for the fruits or the seeds or the flowers. We grow them just for the leaves. And so about midsummer, these plants will try to produce flowering structures. And I recommend that you stifle that, because we have them in place. I mean, unless you want some of their seeds, then it's good to basically crop steer them by stifling all the energy that they would put into those flowers and seeds. And so you cut that off and they keep producing the leaves, which is what is desirable in this context. And along the same line as basil, this is a good example of basil. It's great. It'll grow up in a very apical dominant form. If you just let it grow, it will do this 1 liter all the way up. But again, this is a crop that we want the leaves. We have basically no interest in any flowers or seeds unless we want to save seed. And so you let it grow up. And once it gets to the 3rd node, you can see right here is where that apical leader has been pinched. And you can see that these side sucker branches, basically, that gets pinched away, and you're going to put that in your pasta tonight or whatever. And then these side suckers, which in the tomato context we don't like, but in the basil context, because we want more leaves, then they become the new leaders. So we bush it out rather than being like a one tall, skinny basil plant. By pinching right here, right above these two, then they'll bush out. And then the next time they create a node that looks like this, then you can pinch again, and you're creating a bushier and bushier plant as you go. And they will eventually get to a point in the season where they're trying to produce flowers, but you can just keep on pinching that back and keep them in this rather than the peppers and the cucumbers and the tomatoes, where we want to encourage the generative trend. We're steering it towards the vegetative trend. And you could imagine in this context how we wouldn't want to stress the plant. We would want to have a very consistent watering scheme, which wouldn't stress them. We would want as flat of temperature profiles as we can. You know, you can go back to this and go like, okay, for the vegetative plants, these are the conditions that we want to keep them in as long as we can, so that they can keep on producing the way that we want. Similar with garlic, about mid-June. So you would plant garlic about the 2nd week of October. They love that cold dormant period of the winter, and then they pop up out of the ground in the spring. And by around mid-June, I've noticed in Canada, they will start to produce what we call a scape, which is what their flowering structure would look like. And the closer it gets to the flowering stage, it'll start to curl. And you can actually cut these scapes off and use them in your cooking. They're really, really delicious. They have a intense garlic flavor. So it's beneficial from that point, but it's also this crop steering idea that the part of the garlic that we want to eat is the bulb. And so why would we let the plant put extra energy into its flower and its seed when we can cut this and we can eat this, and then we're directing that energy back down to the bulb so that we get bigger garlic bulbs when we harvest them in early August. Potatoes are another example. and I've never done this before, but as soon as I started reading about this crop steering and understanding vegetative and generative trends, I've always let potatoes in the garden go to flower and produce like their little tiny fruits, just because I thought it was interesting, because you don't see them that much. But now that I know that, when I see the potatoes flowering, unless it's in the context that I want to save their seed, then I'm going to pinch off those flowers so that they're not concentrating their energy in that generative growth. They're concentrating it down into the tubers, which is what we're growing them for. Same idea with deadheading flowers. A lot of flowers that we could grow in the garden will be continuous producers, and if we let them continue to move along in that maturity direction and let them put their energy into maturing their seeds, then they're going to have less energy to produce more of the beautiful flowers that we like. So a lot of gardeners will deadhead the flowers. Once they've got a little bit past their prime, they'll just pinch them off, and either compost them, or hopefully if maybe they're nasturtiums, then they're tasty, spicy flowers that you can add to your salad. Or if they're calendula, then you can make some calendula salve with them, or all sorts of different contexts. And then another example is Brussels sprouts is a plant, a crop that we grow for they produce these tight sprouts, which are basically like immature flowers that are about to flower. And so the trick with growing Brussels sprouts is once you get halfway through the summer and they're growing up, it'll have like this main sort of leafy structure on top, and you can actually cut the top off, and that's eliciting a stressful experience for those Brussels sprouts. And when a plant feels stressed, then they'll be encouraged to try to go to flower sooner because they feel endangered. They have to produce the next generation of seeds. And so the first couple times I tried growing Brussels sprouts, I just let them grow and I didn't stress them at all. And we didn't get any sprouts off them at all. But once I started to realize this idea of crop steering and the appropriate levels of stress of cutting that apical tip off, then you can see that they start to produce those Brussels sprouts at those axils between the leaves and the main stems. Same thing with cauliflower. I had some issues in the past. I couldn't figure out the first couple of years how to actually get the cauliflower head to mature in time. And I didn't want to prune them, but actually pruning the leaves off of them later in the summer is going to create this stressful enough experience for them to want to go to this almost budding state, which is what we harvest the cauliflower for. Same deal with the snap peas. When they go to flower and they start to set their pods, it's really they'll produce more. The more you pick them, the more they'll produce. And it's like it's kind of like the plant psychology equivalent of maybe they think that a deer, all they want in their life at that point is to produce these seeds for the next generation. But if like somebody is picking those off before they're mature, then that just trends them in a more generative sort of direction. And so as the gardener, as the enjoyer of the snap pea, that means they just produce more. And then the last thing I'll add here is for Swiss chard. If you look at that transplant crop reference sheet, you'll see Swiss chard is on the transplant rather than the direct seed sheet. And I've always transplanted them, but I've found it weird because they're in that Chenopodiaceae family with the beets and the spinach, and all of those plant species in that plant family have really sensitive tap roots. and they don't transplant well. And I've found that when I transplant Swiss chard, around 30% of them go to flower earlier. And I think it's because that transplanting process stresses them. And then again, if we think about Swiss chard as why we grow Swiss chard, it's for the vegetative state. So in the future, I'm going to direct seed them rather than transplant them. And I think that's going to be less stressful for them, and they'll stay. It's kind of a way of crop steering them by eliciting less stress for them. And so they'll stay in that vegetative state for longer. Anybody have questions about that?
Nothing right away. Maybe we'll just give it a couple seconds if people are typing.
Okay.
I was going to ask if Swiss chard was in that same family as the spinach and beets, because I had leaf miner on those too. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, there.
Okay. Yeah, here's a question from Katerina. Can you transplant peas?
I've never done it. I think you can, but again, peas are one of these crops that we plant so close together that in order to start enough, you know, in a tray, it doesn't really make sense. I think it just makes more sense to just direct seed them. And peas are so cold hardy, like, yeah, if there wasn't a foot of snow right now, you could start direct seeding those.
Great. And
so just logistically. Yeah.
Siobhan had a pretty important question here. She must have missed a few workshops because she's wondering where Christian's mullet is.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Siobhan. I had to become more aerodynamic, busy times.
That's all the questions for now.
Okay, sweet. So I just had to add this in because this is the kicker. There was this article in last spring that showed that bumblebees understand crop steering. Bumblebees rely on that pollen and nectar in the early season, and they stress plants out by biting little holes in their leaves, and that makes them go to flower sooner, so that the source of organisms that have figured out crop steering. And then, so I had a question, I think it was from Carla, about pruning. And the truth is, I haven't done a lot of woody plant pruning in my experience. I've been mostly annual vegetable gardens, gardening, which isn't a lot of that kind of fruit tree pruning or lilac pruning. And so I can't speak from a point of view of experience, but what I understand from this idea of apical dominance, where most plants will grow primarily from this main leader. And so if we, and you can see here, this was the main leader of like a main axillary branch coming off here. And you can see how somebody cut this. And after that, the apical dominance from there was transferred to these other secondary branches coming off. And so the way I look at pruning in terms of that is like just understanding how apical dominance works and how that applies to your goals and your context. You can use that to shape the architecture of your woody shrubs in the way you want, if you really understand this principle and you're kind of looking at it. And then I can understand why you would prune like a fruit or berry producing bush, transferring it from that context of tomatoes and cucumbers You can prune, you can make decisions in your pruning based on that plant partitioning in order to get the right density of a bush so that it's easy to kind of work around, to get the right kind of balance between the sources and the sinks. So obviously here, if that apical dominance was coming up and it wasn't disturbed, then the amount of secondary branches that, if this was fruit producing, would be smaller, right? There would be less of these side branches that would produce the flowers and fruits. But yeah, so like kind of understanding that where you cut a plant and that response in the apical dominance is going to determine how dense that they grow to, and therefore how many opportunities they have to produce flowers and fruits off of that. Sometimes you'll want to increase the sinks, and maybe sometimes there's not enough of the sources to support the bigger enough of that fruit establishment. And then I also kind of think about pruning as understanding that you can prune to elicit the right amount of stress for that plant. You don't want to super stress it out, but if you prune to create the right amount of stress, then you can encourage more of that flowering and fruiting if that's the specific species. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a lot of experience in pruning there, but that's how I would kind of transfer my knowledge of that crop steering onto other plants. And microgreens. You want to talk about microgreens? We're running out of time. I have so many more to do, but I should talk about microgreens. So these are some pictures of some microgreens that I planted just so I could show the class. The way that I do it is I would weigh the seed out. So like I use these standard trays, which are 10 inches by 20 inches. And I've found that for peas like this, 200 grams of peas will fill one of these trays really densely. And so I'll weigh that out per tray, and I'd soak them for a couple days, but not fully for a couple days. I would go 8 hours of soaking them, and then I'd drain the water out, and I'd let them kind of breathe a little bit, because if they stay underwater for too long, they'll start to ferment and they'll die. So 8 hours, and then let them breathe for a couple hours, and then soak them again, and kind of repeat that for a couple days. And then you can see how I've soaked them and started to get them to sprout a little bit. Some growers will sterilize their seeds in order to, if there's any fungal spores in there that could cause problems later on. I've never really done it, but that's an option. If you're having problem with your trays getting moldy, then that's an option that you might want to look into. And then you can use different sorts of mediums to start in, but I've always just used a 1-to-1 ratio of peat moss and just really regular topsoil. Nothing fancy with it at all. Remember that the seed has all the energy that it needs inside of it from its parent plant already, so you don't have to supply any extra nutrients to them. I just screen it out and get rid of bigger pieces, because the finer the seed bed, same as that direct seeding seed bed prep slide that I talked about, the finer, the more contact, the surface area contact they have with the soil, the more likely they will to germinate consistently. And then I take that mix that's screened out and I fill my containers. And I actually, oh yeah, you can see this wooden press that I made that's the exact same size of that tray. I'll press that soil down in order to firm it up. And then I'll water it. I'll saturate it with water, let that sink in for a couple minutes. And then I just seed as densely as possible without the seeds being on top of one another. And then after I'm done that, I'll press it again with this press, and I'll water it. And as you can see, I have 3 trays stacked on top of each other, germinating all at once. And you can also see that it's not covered in soil, because once they pop up, they would lift the whole shelf of soil. I made that mistake the first time, never again. But so we put that press on top with some bricks, and that simulates that weight of the soil pressing back down so that the roots are able to gain purchase properly. And I'll take these off. I have them stacked overnight, but it'll take a couple days for them really to germinate and get to this stage. But in order to avoid the fungal infection problems, I'll take them off and kind of let them breathe, for a couple hours. Just like fungi do not like ventilated areas. They don't like sunlight. So that kills off any potential infection. And then, yeah, you can see I just only planted that maybe like 2 weeks ago. And each one of those trays would produce over 1 pound of pea shoots. And it's just, this is what I really recommend for growing in the Bow Valley, especially over the winter time, to grow your own fresh greens. Really, really nutritious. Having less light is actually beneficial, like I said before, because then the legginess is in this context a beneficial thing, because they'll get bigger faster. So that is my spiel on microgreens, and I think I'm running out of. Do you want to just take questions now? I had seed saving too and other stuff, but
yeah, it's all right. And maybe if you have some good resources around seed saving and anything else you were going to talk about, we can share those, and I'll email them out. Okay. Jump into some questions. Lynn is saying, we started a community garden. Oops, hold on. Last year with raised beds. We filled the beds with a top quality garden mix soil. Everyone's beds were very productive. We are just wondering how to maintain that for everyone. Should we top it with more garden mix soil or some compost? Then should we add the straw? Some of the beds have sunk as well. How much of each addition should we use?
Okay. I would say the thing about raised beds is that I would generally add like 2 inches of compost. If you're just getting still established, but if it's a raised bed, if you keep on adding 2 inches of compost every year, it's going to be overflowing soon, so it's kind of a decision-making process. I wouldn't add more garden soil. I would just add compost, and once it starts to get higher and getting closer to overflowing, maybe switch to like an input like whether you want to use blood or bone meal, or something that's finer and it's going to provide nutrition, or like kelp meal or something like that, but it's not going to add to these layers that are overflowing for them. That's the one thing about container gardening that's tricky,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great, thank you. Maybe we can, or you can answer, I can't. Ekaterina had emailed me a question earlier about planting potatoes, and if you should continue, just cover it right up with dirt off the start, or if you should do the like kind of staged dirt as the plant grows.
I would recommend, if you have it in a container, you can hill them up over time, but yeah, you would plant them lower down in a container. So like if it was a deep container like that, you would put some soil on the bottom and plant them. And once they germinate up and you have about 30 centimeters of soil, then you would hill them up. And so that way they would produce more tubers. And once they get another 30 centimeters, hill them up again and keep kind of going at that incremental pace so that you have these layers of tubers that are growing.
Great, thank you. No other questions have come in. I can't believe there's no more questions. Does anybody have questions about seed saving? Because Christian wasn't able to get to that tonight. Nothing's coming in, but there's a lot of thanks coming in, Christian. Everybody has really enjoyed this.
Right on.
Yeah, that.
Oh yeah, I didn't get to all these.
Yeah, yeah. Ali, we'll send out some info about the seed saving for you to everybody. Yeah, if there's no more questions coming in, oh wait, there are. What DIY soil mix would you recommend for potatoes, Christian?
For potatoes, I think just like a rich organic matter. Like they don't need sandy soil. They can be nice. It can be nice and richer in organic matter. But yeah, quite a basic topsoil, and then with 2 inches of compost on top is really nice. It doesn't have to be fancy. Potatoes are very, very easy.
Great. And Bridget is wondering where to buy locally bulk soil.
Okay, yeah, I've been getting that question a lot. I recommend my friend's company, JP Paving Stone and Landscaping. As in the past, he's had extra bulk soil that he can drop off, and I think his prices are competitive. But I am biased because he's my friend. But so if you want to, I know that Tam Mans does it as well. And you might want to try, if neither of those work out, maybe try asking the Bow Garden Center up by Alpine Helicopters.
Great, thanks. I don't see any more questions right now. So I just want to thank you so much, Christian. This has been an amazing series. Yeah, I appreciate all the time and work you've put into this. And I think I can speak for everybody just to say that we've learned so much and we're in awe of how much knowledge you have. And yeah, I feel like we could have done an additional 3 or 4 workshops onto this.
Yeah, we really just scratched the surface.
For sure. And like I've been saying throughout, like all these are posted on the Bow Valley Food Alliance website where they'll live, and they'll just be an amazing resource for the future for anybody who wants to learn more and dive a little deeper into gardening. And yeah, just a great resource and an amazing legacy for you to leave behind in the Bow Valley as you move on to yeah, your new adventure in Ontario. So thank you so much. There's a ton of thanks in the chat as well. Yeah, this has been great. Thanks, Lou. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, to wrap it all up, yeah, just I think the most important lesson that I've learned from plants, I think they're the real teachers, and I hope we all kind of work towards curing ourselves of our plant blindness, because I think that they're our most important biological allies. They give us food, they give us oxygen, they give us water, clothes, shelter, and just to start to have a deeper appreciation for them and the gifts that they give us is the most important thing.
Thanks for that, Christian. Agreed. And yeah, so some folks were pretty surprised when they heard that I told everyone that you were moving to Ontario. Do you want to quickly share what you're doing there?
Yeah, sure. I'm starting, I'm helping my sister and brother-in-law start a farm just east of Peterborough, and I'm really excited about it. But I'm kind of sad that I'm leaving too, so.
Yeah, we're sad you're leaving too, but excited for you at the same time. And like I said, this series of workshops is a great legacy to leave behind of your time in the Bow Valley. So thanks so much. And thanks to everyone.
Hopefully you haven't seen the last of me.
Hopefully, yes. Thanks everyone for tuning in over these last few weeks. Yeah, I hope you've learned as much as I have. And yeah, again, if you missed any, they're all on the Bow Valley Food Alliance website. And yeah, take care. Bye everyone.
Thanks everybody.